So while the majority of Americans are fueling their cars with expired fermented Capri Suns and cans of spray-on tanner because they can't afford gasoline anymore, the richest people in the world are jacking up prices in order to get richer. If I say big oil is stealing loads of money from you and everyone, does that shock you? Probably not. Probably less than when you learned Bill Cosby isn't a good tipper. But the sheer breadth of the theft and how exactly they go about it is far less obvious to people and covered less on your morning news than the torrid sexual affairs of the morning news hosts. Well, some of the time. New numbers have just come out showing BP extracted $29 billion in profits out of American consumers last year, while executives vowed to give $2.75 billion back to wealthy shareholders. The American way: steal from the poor, give to the rich. It's like Robin Hood if he had traumatic brain injury and did everything backwards, including shitting out of his mouth. This is one of the largest oil companies in the world in a time when fossil fuels need to be stopped completely if we want to survive on this planet. You know, yeah, it's survival. Is survival something you're into? If you're the average American, you're into photos of the sourdough bread you made yourself, the new workout that involves jumping with your feet behind your head, and of course, competitive slap fights. But planetary survival, I don't know. Maybe on weekends if there's not a game on. Depends on the dip. Like if the dip is being served during the game if it's that kind of spinach dip, that comes in like a bread bowl. I'm not even saying I don't eat the bowl. I'm just you don't eat the bread bowl. It's just like the fact that it's in. You know what I'm saying? The fact that it's in the bread bowl, you figure like, oh, that's a good dip. That's a better dip because it came in bread. What is that? What kind of psychological bullshit is that? BP's $29 billion last year was a 110% increase in profit compared to 2021. So while the majority of Americans are fueling their cars with expired fermented Capri Suns and cans of spray-on tanner because they can't afford gasoline anymore, the richest people in the world are jacking up prices in order to get richer. And BP is not alone among the fossil fuel giants. Shell, $42 billion, that's a 110% increase. ConocoPhillips, $18.6 billion, a 131% increase. ExxonMobil, $57.5 billion, 144% increase. Phillips 66, $8.9 billion, 253% increase. Marathon, $16 billion, a 46% increase. I haven't seen that kind of exponential growth since I got that green fungus on my face from licking the underside of Bam Margera. It was a dare. It wasn't anything weird. Here's how Jordan Schreiber, Director of Energy and Environment at Accountable.us, put it. In 2022, big oil barons like BP waged an all-out war on American consumers, ruthlessly squeezing every last dime out of working and middle-class people. Make no mistake, big oil's never-ending greed was the central force driving the industry's obscene price gouging, forcing families to pay artificially high prices for months on end. Basically, while the planet heats up and people suffer, the big oil companies are richer than ever and polluting more than ever. A large study found that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all global emissions. And towards the top of that list is all of the big oil companies. So how does this happen? How, during a global climate crisis that's pushing us toward extinction, do you have the cause of said crisis selling more and getting richer than ever? Well, turns out it's a guy named Jed, lives in Biloxi, Mississippi. That fucking guy. He's just giving away trillions of dollars to oil companies. I'm like, dude, Jed, come on. No, actually, the cause, there's several causes, none of them are Jed. But, he's still not a good guy. To begin with, as covered on a previous episode of this show, the fossil fuel industry is subsidized at a rate of $11 million per minute. That's per minute. All the externalities of the fossil fuel industry are paid for by you and me. What's that mean? Well, let me pick an example that's a little more relatable. Let's say you had to murder your middle school gym coach. Not when you were in middle school, like 30 years later, right? We've all been there. You don't just have to buy the knife. You have to buy a plastic tarp, a shovel, a ton of bleach. one of those industrial grade deli slicers. Maybe you have to hire a guy to help you carry the body. Maybe you got to rent a truck. Maybe you have to pay another guy to promise to give you an alibi when the cops come knocking on his door. And maybe he realizes that if he speaks up, you're fucked. So he keeps raising the price of his alibi assistance. Before you know it, you're out like tens of thousands of dollars just for one coach. You know, those are all the externalities of the actual murder. What was my point again? Oh yeah, if you want to take out your gym coach from 30 years ago, start a GoFundMe, all right? Get the planning going early. Think ahead, kids. This is no time for amateur hour. Wait, no, that wasn't my point. Oh, my point is nearly every cost associated with fossil fuel use is paid for by us, average citizens. It's not paid for by the companies themselves. $11 million a minute. That's the only way they can take home so much profit. Wouldn't it be great if every cost of problems you caused it was just all funded by taxpayers or subsidized? Like if while driving tanked on Mike's Hard Lemonade, you drove into the side of someone's house, injuring their dog and just killing their Florida room. Like if the repairs to the house, your car, the dog, they were all just paid for by subsidies, just government subsidies. Wouldn't that be nice? Or if you decided to play with a backyard flamethrower and somehow it gets a little out of hand and you burn down your whole neighborhood and government subsidies just used to cover the cost of rebuilding the entire neighborhood and you could just walk away twiddling your thumbs. Wouldn't that be great? That's how the fossil fuel industry operates every day. But beyond just the subsidies, how do the fossil fuel companies get the US government to do everything that benefits them? Such as endless war, invading any country that drops the petrodollar, not putting forward plans that do almost anything to switch to green energy. All of that is wonderful for fossil fuel companies. Well, part of it is funding, aka owning a lot of our politicians, but you already knew that part. However, the politicians don't come up with most of these ideas, these policy initiatives themselves, right? Let's face it, our Congress people are a few bricks short of a Gwyneth Paltrow. No, most of the larger actions the U.S. takes, which inevitably involve the sale and defense of fossil fuels, are put forward by think tanks. Tanks of thought. Unfortunately, those tanks are usually filled with sociopaths, which sounds like the worst exhibit at a freak show. Standard functions of think tanks include generating new ideas not yet crystallized in policy, assessing existing policies, drawing attention to heretofore neglected problems, convening experts to discuss these matters, and engaging with the media. They also often have a revolving door that goes straight into presidential administrations, where they bring their ideas, mostly bad ideas.
No, I really I got some bad ideas in my head.
That guy later became Secretary of State. Let's go through some of the biggest, most powerful think tanks and who funds them. The Atlantic Council, a hugely influential think tank in Washington that also does things like decide what content is allowable on Facebook. Anything that doesn't align with said Atlantic Council gets banned or heavily shadow banned. Well, they're funded by BP, Chevron, Abu Dhabi Oil Corp, all the usual characters. How does that influence them? Here's an example. Atlantic Council CEO and president is someone named Frederick Kemp, seen here in all of his effervescent magnetism.
Oh, I just love it. People together in person, talking to each other, not getting quite enough of it. So what a remarkable evening it's been thus far.
Wow! Just wow. I haven't seen that much charisma since a young Jack Nicholson burst onto the scene. Anyway, Kemp recently penned a column addressing the fact that some climate activists were aghast this Thursday when the UAE named Sultan Al Jaber, the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, as president of this year's COP28. That's right, the CEO of an oil company was named the president of the largest climate summit in the world. That's like naming Caligula as president of a children's hospital. So Kemp, in his column, heaped praise on Al Jaber, saying there's no one better than this oil magnate to run the largest climate conference. What Kemp failed to mention was the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and Masdar, where Sultan Al Jaber serves as CEO and chairman, respectively, are sponsors of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum. The Atlantic Council is funded by the oil titan they're fucking defending. And this goes for pretty much all of the major think tanks in Washington. For example, CNAS, the Center for a New American Security, funded by Chevron, BP, ExxonMobil, Heritage Foundation, funded by $780,000 from ExxonMobil, and over $6 million from Koch Foundations, whose fortune comes from petroleum products. Another think tank, the German Marshall Fund, funded by ExxonMobil. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, funded by BP, Chevron, Exxon, and ConocoPhillips. The Hudson Institute, funded by ExxonMobil and the David H. Koch Charitable Foundation. Isn't it nice that the biggest villains in the world can fund their repulsive, warped soul activities and call it a charity? It's like a kidnapper writing off his cage purchases as charitable giving. And finally, Brookings Institute. It's the most cited think tank by American politicians and media, and some consider it one of the more liberal think tanks. Well, as you might have guessed, they're funded by BP, Chevron, and Charles Koch. You see, the terrible ideas that our leaders turn into policy initiatives have to come from somewhere. And we know they don't come from the vacant, echoing, abandoned grocery store parking lot brain of Joe Biden, or the chaotic orgy of disease zombies that makes up the brain matter of Donald Trump, or the empty, soggy paper bag caught in a tree that constitutes George W. Bush's gray matter. You know what? None of them were good. Every president since Garfield. He was a firecracker, though, that guy. The policies that our leading sociopaths turn into kinetic actions of assholery perpetrated against the world often come from these very think tanks, which are funded by big oil, weapons contractors, and other multinational corporate interests, and a little bit by John Voight. So we give big oil trillions in the form of subsidies so they can then use that not only to fill their pockets, but also to create policies that defend the destruction of the planet. That's it. That's the most sensitive news for this week. But we have a new episode every week, and we are completely funded by you guys. We are completely independent. Please become a member at patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. I also do 2 interviews a week with amazing people like Professor Alex Vitale I just talked to about the end of policing, Ben Norton, Scott Ritter, Richard Wolff, Stella Assange, Chris Hedges, all those people. It's all at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Keep fighting.